welcome to month 2 of the Red Manor House Block of the Month Sew Along. I'm Jenni Smith and I'm going to talk you through now adding on the borders to the house block that you created last month, and also the first part of foundation paper piecing that's in this sew along. You've got your completed house block from month 1, and what we're now going to do is to add a small border onto that before we move on to the next foundation pieced border. So we've given you the cutting instructions for the dimensions, and what I wanted to say is that it's actually really important when you're adding borders onto a quilt to make sure that you do measure before you add them. It's very tempting to just cut a strip of fabric that's the correct width and then to get your central piece that you're adding it onto and sew along until you get to the end and then just cut it off. And that's what I used to do. But the danger with doing that is that because you haven't measured it and made it fit, that it can make the entire block go out of shape, and it actually often stops the quilt block and the quilt itself when it's finished from laying really nicely and flat. And in this quilt there are 4 borders that we add on, so if each time you weren't measuring and just adding a strip and trimming it off at the end, you could end up with a quilt that's quite out of shape at the end. And also sometimes it can create a kind of wave because you've got more fabric here, you've got an excess of fabric that ends up bigger, even if it's ½ an inch or so, than actually what you're sewing it onto, and that's when things start to go a little bit wrong. So do actually measure them, cut them to the right length, and then it's a little bit like when you're dressmaking, I guess, is that what you want to do is take the border and you want to get it where it's going on to. So I'll be stitching this way up again so that I can see that these seams lay flat, and first of all pin one end and pin the other. If you want to also make a centre point and pin that, but what you end up doing is actually just easing the border to fit so that you know it's going to lay flat once you've pressed it. So with this we're going to add on the 2 short borders to the top and the bottom of the house first and press those, and then add the right and the left border on and press that unit. When you have got your house block and this small border has been added on and pressed, then the size at this stage will be 14½ inches square. So just have a check and make sure that you're on track before we go on to make the next border with the foundation piece diamonds. So a couple of years ago, if I'd have looked at a pattern or a block of the month and seen foundation paper piecing, I would probably have thought, oh, maybe I'll pass that one, because I think it's something that psychologically people have a bit of a barrier. I think they think it's a little bit scary, and actually it's one of those skills that once you've got it, it's brilliant. And there are so many patterns out there now that are foundation pieced that I think it opens up lots of creative opportunities. So it was the one skill that I really wanted to put into this block of the month, and it's the one thing that I really want people to have a go at, and you will grasp it. It's repetition, and that's why in this block of the month as well we've designed the foundation piece units, that there's a lot of repetition, because that's the way that it sticks in your mind initially, because you're sewing on the other side of papers. It feels a little bit counterintuitive, but then once you get into the rhythm of doing it, it all makes perfect sense. With foundation paper piecing, you can use fabric that you already have at home and take small pieces that you cut from it as you go. What we've tried to do is, because the shapes are uniform, so you're repeating the unit, is to actually give you some cutting instructions so that you can use your fabric as economically as possible. So we've advised that you cut strips that are the width of the fabric, or if you're using fat quarters, then double up those quantities, because you'll have, you know, half of the width, to create some rectangular units that you're using to cover each corner of your diamond, and also to cut the central pieces for your diamonds larger as well. And it just means that it's going to save you time if you know that you've got particular sizes to work with. So the first set of cutting instructions that we've given is to make these rectangles here that are 4 inches by 2 inches, and each one of those is plenty of fabric to sew and turn to make each of the corners of your diamond. If you're a little bit more confident with foundation paper piecing and you're used to the angles, then you can actually be slightly more economical with your fabric, so that if you cut a rectangle that is 4.5 inches by 2.5 inches, then you can get 2 pieces, so 2 corner units out of 1 rectangle, which is just slightly bigger. What you have to remember though, if you're going to do that, is that when you are subcutting these rectangles, you need to make sure that you end up with pairs. So if you cut on the diagonal one way, so from right to left, then you need to mirror that, and you also need to cut the same amount of units where you start down here in the left-hand corner and cut across to the right, so you end up with opposite orientations. When you're foundation paper piecing, you're basically stitching a straight line. So you can use the regular presser foot that comes with your machine, which on mine is this A foot here. What I actually find easier, having done a lot of foundation paper piecing, is if you do have another foot. So this is my F foot, which is what came with my machine for when I'm doing appliqué or decorative stitches, and it's a lot clearer, the plastic at the front of the foot here. So basically that means you can see the needle better, and because you're stitching on a very fine line, I find it easier to be more accurate if I can actually see the needle. So I use my F foot when I'm foundation paper piecing. And another thing just to think about is that your machine needle, because you're sewing through paper, it will eventually become blunt. So I wouldn't use my sewing machine needle for lots of foundation paper piecing and then skip to piecing something on regular fabric, because you also run the danger of damaging your fabric. So what I do is I get my machine needle at the end of the session and stick it in a bit of paper so that I know that's my needle for foundation paper piecing, and just keep that to one side. Essentially, when you're foundation paper piecing, your stitching is going through your fabric and through your paper, and at the end you remove the papers from the stitching. So really the stitching creates tiny perforations, which mean that the papers then come away easily. What that means is that on your sewing machine you need to have a very small stitch length, because when you take the papers away you don't want those stitches to come undone. So it's the only time really in quilting when you go down even smaller than a 2.2 or 2.4 stitch length. And what you want to set your machine to, here is the stitch width, which I've put back to normal from my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and my stitch length is here, so I'm going to move it down. And people would recommend between a 1.5 and a 1.8 millimetre stitch length. 1.5 from personal experience is a nightmare if you have to unpick. It really is tiny. So my favourite is 1.8. So I always set my machine at that when I'm stitching. If you forget and you do your first row a little bigger, I would just repeat it and go over those stitches with a smaller stitch length and then carry on. What you're going to do is you're going to print off the sheet of paper that has got the diamond template on. And then what you need to do is, when you look at it here, the bold line, the darkest line that you can see, is the finished size of the block when it's stitched into the other diamonds that are going into the border. The fainter line here is the line that you're going to trim it down to, and this is your 1/4 inch seam allowance between the two of them. But you don't want to cut down to that outer line straight away. So I always give myself a little bit of extra around it, so that when I'm piecing the block, I'm not going right up to those edges, and then I trim it down afterwards. So just cut it out roughly. It doesn't have to be any precise measurement. And then once you've got this unit here, you're ready to start putting your fabric onto it and making your first block. The essential tools when you're foundation paper piecing is obviously the paper templates. You've got the fabric. It's handy just to have a couple of pins, and also if you want to use it, then I like to use a glue pen as well, just for starting off with the first bit. I've got a light box so that I can see through to the lines, but if you haven't got a light box, then just use your window of wherever you're working in a little bit of daylight. So what you're going to do is you're taking your template and you're taking the fabric that you're using for the diamond, which is coloured in a different colour as well on here just to help you. And what you need to do with this is line it up on the opposite side of where the printed pattern is. So you're turning it over onto the plain side, but you can see through it because you're close to a window or a light source. And you're taking your fabric and it's the right way up. So the pattern is downwards and your fabric is right side up. And what you're going to do is you've got to position this fabric so that it covers the entire area of the diamond. So if you then turn it over towards the light source, you can see that you want to be able to check that you're at least a 1/4 inch clear of the outer points of the diamond with the fabric. And that's why really when somebody first taught me foundation paper piecing, they said be kind to yourself when you're starting out. Don't try and be too economical with your fabric, because that's when you get caught out and that's when you think I can't do it and you put it away and get cross with it. So cut bigger pieces of fabric. That's what we've done. We've given you a nice sized rectangle so that you're definitely going to be clear of that diamond and then it won't go astray. So once you know that it's definitely covering that area, what's helpful is just to turn it back over and just to put a little dot of fabric glue. So it's just a temporary adhesive just to make sure that this now doesn't shift. So you can just put on a couple of spots onto the paper and then just press the fabric down and that will stick that in place. So before I get to doing any actual stitching on the machine, what I need to do now is get my second piece of fabric and position that. So first of all, I'm going to flip this back over, and the unit that I've covered with the dark fabric for the diamond is B1. And in foundation paper piecing, what you're always doing is then moving on to the next number, so working in sequence. So what I need to do next is I need to fold the line between 1 and 2. So I'm going to take, either you can use a thin piece of card or you can use a ruler like this that's got a thin edge. This is the add a quarter ruler, and you're going to position that on to the line between 1 and 2, and you're going to fold that back. So you just finger press it and fold it back. And this fabric here now is going to be trimmed away. So the other side of the ruler has got a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. So what you can do is you can butt that right up to the edge of the paper, and you can see that it can't slide out of position. If not, you can use a standard ruler and just make sure that you've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But these are really, really helpful when you're foundation paper piecing. And then with your rotary cutter, you're going to trim that excess fabric away. So sometimes, again, it feels a little bit strange to be trimming fabric before you've done any stitching, but that's what you need to do to be able to line up your next piece correctly. So then you're going to turn this back over now. So fold the paper back, turn the block back over, and obviously the good thing about having this video is that you can watch it over and over again until you get into the rhythm of doing this. And the next challenge now, if I just go back to the light source, is to actually lay this down. And because you've got that trimmed edge there now, you can take your next piece of fabric and align the edges. And what you have to figure out is that once you've stitched here at a 1/4 inch away, so on the line on the other side, that when this fabric folds back, again, you will have coverage at least 1/4 inch around the edges of your diamond. So you can just do a little test like that against a light source to see that you've covered the underneath. And when you're happy that that's in the correct position, sometimes you just have to move it a little bit to one side or the other to know that you're clear. But once that's lined up, if you want to do, you can just pop a little pin in there to secure those two pieces of fabric. So what you've now got on the opposite side of your template is a piece of fabric that's the right side up, another piece of fabric that's right side down, so it's right sides together. And when you turn that over, you're now ready to do some stitching and machine your first line on the line here and across there. The little bit of glue that you've used and the pin are just extra security so that when you get to your machine and you now turn this over to be machining on the printed side of the paper, that they don't shift. So that's the purpose of those. So when you turn it over carefully once you're on your machine, you're now lining up. And what is really good practice when you're foundation piecing is to always start stitching beyond 1/4 of an inch of the line that you're going on to. And then when your block is finished, you know that underneath all the seams are securely in place. So I've got my stitch length at 1.8, and the good thing about foundation paper piecing once you have grasped it is that you are literally sewing on a straight line. So anybody that can handle a machine and can sew on a line and follow that can do foundation paper piecing. So I'm starting off a little bit beyond it, and then I'm coming on to the line, and then because I've got that clear foot that I talked about, the F foot, I can see my needle really nicely. There's no need to sew too fast because you want to be as accurate as possible, and then you sew 1/4 of an inch at least beyond the end of the point as well, and then cut your threads. So when I undo this pin and that's now stitched, then I can see that when that goes back, I've made the first corner of my diamond unit. And what I need to do now, you always, when you're foundation paper piecing, you go from the sewing machine to the pressing station and give that a good press before you do anything else. Some people do finger press when they're foundation paper piecing. Personally, I like to press with an iron in between times. We also figured out at our studio that if you're eating a lot of cake and things whilst you're sewing, foundation paper piecing is quite good for burning calories because you're constantly between the cutting table and the sewing machine and the pressing station, and it keeps you moving, so it's good for you. So if you then get the iron, what you're doing is you're now pressing back the seam that you've just created. So you are putting it back and then you're just pressing there. Don't worry that there's paper underneath because you're not pressing it for too long, and you do need a good hot iron because you actually want to get that sitting really, really nice and flat, because you don't get the opportunity. What happens with foundation piecing is you're then adding on another layer, so you don't really get the opportunity to go back to that seam, so you need it to lay flat. So once you've pressed it, then you're going back now to fold the next section and to trim again. Okay, so you have sewn your first two pieces together, and now it gets much easier. I find it's always just getting those first two pieces aligned and trimmed that is the trickiest part, and then you get into a rhythm. So now that's pressed, I come back to the cutting mat, flip over again, and now I'm going on to my next unit. So I've done B2, so I'm moving on to B3. And so I'll just turn this around, and then the next thing to do is to fold this line again. So the line isn't from 2 to 3, it's from 1 to 3 in this case, but you always just go up in whichever number is coming next, and that's the next piece. So I'm going to lay my ruler on the edge here, fold it back again, and where I've stitched beyond the 1/4 inch seam allowance, it means that the fabric's attached here a little bit. What you just do is you just peel it back gently so the paper comes away. You're not actually affecting the stitches like that. And then you turn the ruler around again, and you trim to that 1/4 inch seam allowance. One thing I'll just tell you is that with the add a quarter rulers, if you're ever tempted to trim using this thin edge, then what happens is you cut a bit of the plastic away, which is what I did. So don't do that, because they're quite expensive pieces of kit, and they're really, really useful, and they're not as useful once there's a little bit of it shaved off. So on this one, I'm promising to be good with this new ruler. And if you turn it, butt it up again, so it's fold and then it's trim. So you're taking away the 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're taking away that extra, so you've got that there, protective, and then you're turning it back over, you're getting your next piece, which you know is to cover there, and you're lining it up again, ensuring that when it's folded back, again, it's going to cover all of your seam allowances. So the good thing about this unit is that you're repeating the same angles over and over again. In other more complex foundation piece patterns, you'll move on to that each part might be on a different angle, so you will have to keep doing this. But because these are the same, you will get used to doing them and it will become easier. If you wanted to pin again here, you could do. If not, you now turn it over carefully, go back to the machine, and now you're stitching this line here. The alternative way to cut your rectangles is to also cut them across. So I said at the beginning, this is a slightly more economical use of fabric, but it does mean that it makes it slightly harder just to position it on the paper. So with this, you obviously have to ensure that when this is going to be stitched on the right way, that it's at the correct angle, and then you align it up again. And because you haven't got as much fabric here, you just have to check that once you're at that 1/4 inch seam allowance and it's folded back, that it's still going to cover the entire diamond shape. So what you'll find is you probably just need to tweak it slightly, and like if I move that further left there and then fold it back, I know it's going to cover it. So sometimes it's just a little bit of trial and error, and again, just getting your eye in and practice will make this easier, but you can have a go and just see how you get on. So once you have stitched all 4 rectangles around your central diamond, you will end up with a unit that looks like this, and it looks a bit messy at this stage, but then what you have to do is trim it down and then it all makes perfect sense. So what you need to do is you flip it over, and then you're now trimming it down to the fainter line that I talked about earlier, because then that still gives you a seam allowance for sewing it into the next diamond block. Just be mindful that if you're doing a lot of foundation paper piecing as well, then eventually your rotary cutter, the blade will be blunted because you're cutting through paper. So I've got 2 rotary cutters, and I use one just for trimming down my paper blocks because I do this quite a lot, and one that I just keep for my fabric, but it will blunt it a little bit, just like the needle. You can use any ruler for trimming down, because you're not measuring, you're just following a line basically. If you are going to use your 1/4 ruler, make sure you're using that deeper side, but I would generally use my usual quilting ruler when I'm doing this. So you're just by eye aligning the fainter line with your quilting ruler and trimming all the excess fabric and all the excess paper away, and just work your way around. So this is the satisfying bit as well, when you start to see why foundation paper piecing is so nice, because the beauty of it is you get really, really fine points and precise piecing. So that's the finished diamond shape as it is. You've obviously got these little overlapping seams here, but they will disappear, so that when it's actually stitched in the final quilt, then you won't see any of that. You'll just have these exact points here meeting at your seam edges. 3 of these diamond units make up one side of the border that's going to surround the Red Manor House quilt block that you have made. You don't take the papers out at this stage, so make each of your units and keep the papers in, because they're really useful, because you've still got that 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that when you're adding this one onto your next diamond, you can pin through the papers and stitch through those as well. So don't take them out just yet. There's a very high chance that at some stage when you're new to foundation paper piecing, or even if you're not, that you will go wrong along the way and just get an angle that's slightly out, or you've just missed off a corner. I can see from this that if I was to fold this backwards, I'm not far out, but I'm about 2 millimeters off actually having covered the entire area of the rectangle. And I know, I guess, that actually that isn't my stitching line, that's just my cutting line. So I could get away with it, but then you're allowing yourself a very narrow seam allowance, which really, for the integrity of the whole quilt at the end isn't a great thing. So you can unpick basically through the papers, and even though it's a small stitch length, you would go in and unpick, and sometimes because the paper's been perforated, it comes away a little bit, but again, in the past I've just stuck a little bit of sellotape over the stitch line and stitched through that just to keep it intact, to make that line good. But it's worth doing, because I think once you start gambling with the angles, then it might cause you trouble later on. So the diamond border is stitched onto the smaller border that you've added around the house. 3 diamond units, once they're all sewn together, make up the same depth as the border, and what you're adding onto 2 of them is the corner units here as well. In the original Red Manor House Coverlet, when we went to study it, there's quite a few blocks that have got a diamond motif in them. There's a cow that has got a diamond floating above it in the sky, and some other little details that just seemed to be a motif that was repeated around the coverlet. So we thought that they made a pretty border, something a little bit different as well, and also that it would be a great way to introduce foundation paper piecing. Join me, Jenni Smith, with some of my other friends from the quilting community to sew along with the Red Manor House Coverlet Block of the Month programme to celebrate the Quilters Guild's 40th birthday.